So I give a lot of these talks about what the company is doing, what we're making happen here in Grand Bahama and in the Caribbean, and I will shortly get to a PowerPoint that I have that'll kind of run through what I do and what we as Coral Vita do, which is, as Christina said, a company that is doing coral reef restoration. But in this kind of setting with the audience, as I've been told, you guys are all kind of young professionals finding your way in the kind of potentially world-changing environmental field or whatnot. I'm happy to kind of shift the discussion so that it's a little less me presenting at you guys what I'm all about, and maybe opening it up to a bit more discussion as far as what you guys want to talk about. Maybe it's not so much my company, but my path and how I kind of got to where I'm at, and advice I have to young people. I don't know what it is. I feel pretty young myself, but happy to go through that. So if anybody has any questions along the way or things they want to talk about, please jump on in. I've been told that I have about 20 to 25 minutes or so plus questions. So I'll kind of run through the company's pitch deck, which I have here, and then we can take it from there into whatever kind of conversations you guys are interested in having. So let me share my screen real quick. Is that working? Nice. So boom. Coral Vita, the name of the company. So we restore dying coral reefs, and I'll tell you a bit more about how we do that. My name is Gator Halpern. As the intro said, I'm from San Diego, proud Californian, but now living here in the Bahamas, where we're building our coral farms. So you can see here, beautiful coral reef. I don't know how many of you have had the pleasure of seeing these coral reefs in the wild, but they're pretty magical ecosystems. You go scuba diving on them, snorkeling on them, and it immediately becomes clear that you're in a very special, amazing place, thriving with life. Coral reefs, they cover 0.01%, or it's 0.1%, so like far less than 1% of the ocean floor, yet 25% of all marine life exists in these dynamic ecosystems. It's where you find all the octopus, sea turtles, a lot of sharks and fish, and all these things exist in coral reef habitats. And that's really what got me into it. I just love being in the ocean, love seeing these animals, being with the animals. Kind of scuba diving is almost like being an astronaut in a foreign world where there's actually incredibly beautiful life everywhere. So, I do what I do because I love the ecosystem and coral reefs in general. But also, coral reefs are one of the most valuable ecosystems in the world economically and for supporting the livelihoods of over 1 billion people around the world. And that's mainly through 3 different things. Get back on. One of them is tourism. So here in the Bahamas or the Great Barrier Reef or many tropical places around the world, the highlight of any tourist trip is to go to these beautiful coral reefs, to snorkel on them, to scuba dive on them. And so they're huge drivers of tourism and tourism economies all around the world. They also are, I think this is another tourism picture, but you can see beautiful scuba diving going on there. They're also essential for fisheries. So most of the fish caught in the tropics depend upon coral reefs for at least one stage of their livelihoods. So a lot of fish are bred in coral reefs, and the little baby fish are hanging out in coral reefs before they get large enough to swim out to sea. And so the coral reef is essential for food security and for the fisheries economy, the industry, in tropical countries all around the world. And then one that's a little less top of mind, but equally, if not more important, is the shoreline protection value that reefs provide. So reefs form basically a natural seawall. You can see the numbers there. They reduce wave power by up to 97%. So the waves break on the reef, and then by the time they get to shore, there's not too much power in them. But if there's no reef there, then the waves erode the shoreline, and they also, with increasing storm surges due to climate change, they can really devastate coastal communities with big waves coming in and just flooding property along the coast. And so those reefs are a very essential protection, shoreline protection, like a natural seawall in really a lot of coastal areas all around the world. There's some numbers here. I don't really want to get into it in the weeds, but it costs a hell of a lot to build a seawall that functions half as good as just a living coral reef would. The problem is coral reefs are dying at really frightening rates. So I'm sure many of you have seen in the news around the world like how much reefs are actually suffering due to a lot of human impacts like pollution, overfishing, poor development practices on coastline, but then also increasingly the real issue killing huge swaths of reef is global warming and warm temperatures getting too high for corals, and they end up dying. And so it's kind of visualized here. You see this reef in 1975. This is a reef just across from where I'm at now in the Florida Keys. And then that's a picture from the same exact place today. As you can see, it's just reduced to rubble covered in algae. And sadly, this is happening all over the world. Here in the Bahamas, I go scuba diving regularly, and most of what I see looks kind of like this picture, whereas before it was a thriving, beautiful reef. So some stark stats, and I pulled this presentation from a slide deck I did about a year ago or 6 to 8 months ago maybe, and these numbers that over 30% of the world's reefs are dead have been revised by the latest scientific research. That number is now as high as 50% of the world's reefs are dead. That's mostly due to the studies that have been done in the Great Barrier Reef, which was relatively healthy until 2015, 2016, and into 2017, there were, or I think it was mostly 16 and 17, there were 2 back-to-back really bad bleaching events that killed half of the Great Barrier Reef in just 2 years. This is an ecosystem that took millions of years to grow into the majesty that it is today, and half of it died in just a couple of years. It's pretty incredible. Here in the Caribbean, we're in really bad shape. 80% of the reefs are already dead. And scientists project that, with global warming increasing, by mid-century, by 2050, over 90% of coral reefs are going to die. And that's like a pretty conservative estimate. Some people say that 95 or more percent of reefs will be dead by 2050 if we don't take serious active measures to change this. And of course, with these reefs dying, those values that I talked about before, the coastal protection, the fisheries, the tourism, are all at risk. And the communities that benefit from having healthy reefs are going to suffer as their reefs die. And a lot of communities are already suffering. Here in my island in Grand Bahama, where I'm living, they had to build a seawall for many millions of dollars because the whole shoreline was eroding, with no reef there to block the waves. The good news is there are things we could do to bring these reefs back to life. A technique called coral farming, where we actually grow corals, enables us to restore reefs in the same way that we reforest plots of land where we go planting trees. We literally grow coral and plant them back into reefs. And this has been shown to bring these reefs back to life. It's an incredible process to watch. As soon as you put these corals back into the ocean, fish start coming around. You see an immediate boost to the ecosystem. It's really an awesome process. The problem is that the traditional means of coral farming are these ocean-based farms, like the one you see pictured here, where you basically hang corals off ropes, or they have different PVC structures to grow coral off of, and it's not very scalable. While it does great work and can bring a reef back to life, you pretty much have to build one of these farms next to every reef you're trying to restore. And 90% of the world's reefs being dead, it's not really a feasible thing. You also can really only grow the branching species of coral that are naturally fast growing, because you're just hanging it in the ocean and waiting for it to grow. The species you see there, that's Acropora cervicornis. It's called a staghorn. And that'll grow from like a pinky to maybe a hand and a wrist in 6 months, as fast as 6 months to a year. And then you could plant it out there. But a lot of the slower growing species, like the bouldering corals, the brain corals, and star corals, they grow really slowly. So you can't just put them in an ocean nursery, wait for them to grow, and plant them back out there. So the traditional type of reef restoration, these ocean-based farms, is not really going to make the difference we need if we're going to keep reefs around for generations to come. So at Coral Vita, we're trying to innovate on the coral farming model and have developed a different technique that's a bit more high-tech, a little bit more capital-intensive. And we use land-based farms where we have tanks like the one you see pictured here, and we can grow our corals in these tanks, which allows us to do a few different things. The first is that we can boost the coral's resilience to climate change. So basically, the corals that you're planting out from a tree nursery or something like that, they could very well die as water temperatures get warmer and they reach the same fate as the other corals out there. And so that's not really solving the issue. We don't want to grow corals and plant them out just to watch them die a few years later. So what we can do is actually a technique called assisted evolution, pioneered by our partners at the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology. We could basically crank up the heat and crank up the acidity within these coral tanks and slowly acclimate the coral to those warmer conditions so that they can survive them once they see them back out in nature. And we can also see which individual genotypes are naturally most resilient against those warming, more acidic oceans. And we can use those genotypes to seed the next batch of coral that we grow so that each batch we outplant into the reef is more resilient and more capable of surviving than the batch before it. We can also accelerate coral growth rates by up to 50 times how fast they grow in nature. So that brain coral you see there was grown in like 6 months, whereas to reach that size in nature could take decades. And we do that through a technique called microfragmentation, which was pioneered by our advisor, Dr. David Vaughn. Basically, that technique is breaking the corals apart into tiny pieces and fusing them back together, because corals are really amazing creatures. I don't want to do a whole coral biology 101 at the moment, but they're colonies of individual animals that grow together to form one coral. So you see a coral, it could be thousands of different animals fused together. They're actually clones, so kind of the same animals, but different individuals. And then we can break those apart and space them out, and then they kind of heal and fuse back together. In the background, you can kind of see a few fragments fusing back together. And so repeating that process, breaking them apart, fusing them together, breaking them apart, fusing them together, allows us to grow corals much, much faster than they naturally grow, unlocking the ability to grow a lot of different species, slower growing species that traditionally haven't been able to be used in restoration projects. And the last point that's amazing for land-based farms is that it's a much more scalable model. So this is a map of the island I live on, Grand Bahama, and the red dots you can imagine are in-ocean nurseries. To restore the reefs around Grand Bahama, we would need these nurseries everywhere. Probably way more nurseries than you see on this map in order to really restore all the reefs around this area. But our land-based model, we just need to add more tanks. So we can potentially build a farm big enough here in Grand Bahama so that we can grow hundreds of thousands, if not millions of corals at a single site, and then distribute those corals around the island to different restoration projects. And so it's a much more scalable model. And the idea is that it wouldn't just be for one island, but eventually, if we're able to scale up large enough, we can have a farm big enough to distribute corals to different restoration projects, not only in our island, but all around the Bahamas. And then, the vision is to have a global network of these farms so that every island nation or coastal tropical nation that is dealing with reef degradation can have a large-scale coral vita farm providing climate change resilient corals for restoration projects. So right now we're building our pilot project here in Grand Bahama, which is a relatively small-scale facility growing about 3,000 to 5,000 coral colonies a year to plant out in the reefs, which you can see at the bottom there translates to about 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And the plan is after these next couple of years at that size, probably this year at that size, we'll continue scaling up so that we can go from a few thousand to a few 100,000 in just the next couple of years. So here is just a really brief look at what we're building. I don't want to go into the details there much, but here's the architectural rendering. I'll get to the real pictures in a second, but you can see that this isn't really an industrial kind of facility. It's more of an ecotourism attraction and an education center. And that's because we're not a nonprofit like just about all the other reef restoration organizations out there. We think that by being a commercial company and actually making money by doing reef restoration, we'll be able to scale to reach unprecedented size and really develop an industry around reef restoration that can hopefully make a much larger impact, a significant impact on the ecological scale of the problem. And so this first portion of our farm before the expanded site is really a showcase that we're trying to bring a lot of guests through. We have a touch tank in the middle for children to come and learn about what's going on. We'll be leading tours through the center and having local school groups through. And here is a picture of, this was, I think, last week. We're already a little further along than this, but I took this picture while I was standing on top of our welcome center, which is kind of the tourism zone, at the courtyard of tanks you see there. There will be shade cloths on those posts above the tanks, and each tank will have up to 1,000 baby corals, or maybe 50 to 100 mature corals, depending on the species. Here's another look. You can see the tanks there, and then on the right we have the shipping containers, which are pretty interesting. Basically, we've retrofitted those shipping containers so that it's not only a little office space, but the real key is that it's a wet lab. So we have a recirculating system being built in there of deep coral tanks that we can both do experiments in, and it functions as a hurricane shelter. So a lot of these areas will be working, and definitely here in the Bahamas, it's just a matter of time until a hurricane comes. So we have to be prepared for that. And basically, when a hurricane comes through, we'll take all the coral that are out in those outdoor tanks and move them into the shipping container, batten down the hatches, and turn on the generator. Let that run for the week or so it takes for us to get the outdoor tanks back up and running and can move those corals back outside. So this is just a view of the Welcome Center mid-construction. It's like I said already, a little further along in this picture. But basically, the guests will come in here. It'll be kind of like an aquarium museum with signage, and we'll be giving tours through to have some revenue at the farm, paying for the operations at this scale. And we grow these corals in tanks like the one you see here, and then once they're mature enough, we scuba dive down and actually plant these corals back out into the ocean and see the reef come back to life. So in addition to the ecotourism that we have coming through, we also are having our farms be an education center for the local community. We take a kind of community-based approach to all the projects we're doing. After all, it is the people of the Bahamas that are benefiting most from the reefs here, and they're the real stewards in the long-term health of these reefs. And so having the local community involved in our projects, from the education side of things to being employed at our farm, helping us plant corals is a big part of what we're doing. And we're looking to scale this up pretty quickly. So in 2020, we'll be expanding the farm from the 3,000 to 5,000 corals to 100,000 corals, getting the cost per coral down and the impact up so that we're restoring a lot more reef around the world. And at that scale, we're not only making money by having guests come through the farm, but we're actually selling the service of reef restoration to different customers who benefit from having a healthy reef. So it could be hotels, it could be developers looking to build projects on the coastline, it could be mitigation banks for people, damaging reefs through dredging projects, so other development projects could pay for restoration, marine protected areas, as well as corporate sponsors. There's a whole range of customers who really benefit from having a healthy reef. And at the larger scale, we'll be able to sell them the service of, okay, here's 10,000 corals, we'll plant into your reef in this size and shape, and you'll benefit from these ways. You can pay us for those services. So really quickly, the kind of rollout plan right now, we're finishing construction on this farm. We should have corals in the tanks hopefully by the end of the month, if not definitely by early May. And just next year, we're planning on scaling up through 2021, having a much bigger farm capable of that large-scale restoration. And like I said, from there, we're trying to build these farms all over the world. So yeah, I hope you can come down here to the Bahamas sometime if you're a scuba diver and see our project, help us plant some corals, or if you're not a scuba diver, see our project on land and maybe snorkel and see the reef. So I'll stop there and see what kind of questions you guys have. I'm happy to talk more about the ins and outs of coral farming and our company. I'm also happy to talk about, what got me here today and why I'm a, coral farmer, if you guys are interested in the more personal story. But I'll leave it there for now.
I'll start. I do have a question. I've heard through social media and whatnot that us as humans that sometimes our sunscreen could be help damage the coral reefs. Is there a certain type of sunscreen that you would recommend to us or whatnot?
Yeah, so sunscreen can definitely be bad for coral reefs. The chemical that you got to look out for is called oxybenzone. So if you're using oxybenzone sunscreen on a coral reef, it can be harmful. So any kind of reef-safe sunscreen or zinc-based is usually a good thing to look out for. There's a lot of choices out there. I don't want to choose a particular one and play any favorites at the moment. But really, sunscreen gets a lot of press in the coral damage world. And it is a problem when you have lots and lots of tourists and people on a particular reef. So if you're trying to manage a tourism reef, at a place that gets a lot of people on it, then sunscreen can definitely be a problem for that area. But in general, when we're talking about, half the world's reefs dying or 90% by 2050, that's not because of sunscreen. That's because of global warming, and it's because of overfishing. So while sunscreens, I'm not trying to belittle it and say it's not an issue. It's definitely not one of the major culprits when we're thinking about how much reefs die.
Thank you for that.
For sure.
Any other questions?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. So what kind of inspired you to get into this field in the first place? Like, were you always super environmentally aware growing up? Or is it something that you kind of discovered later on? How did that whole passion start?
Totally, yeah. So I grew up in San Diego and have always loved the ocean. Spent pretty much as much time as I could growing up as, on the beach and in the waves. But it was probably when I was in high school that I figured out I wanted to be doing something in the environmental field. I was really lucky as a kid to be able to travel around and kind of saw from airplanes and from car trips and the like, just how much humans were shifting the landscape. And it became clear to me that I wanted to spend my life kind of trying to help find a better balance between society and the environment, because things are clearly not in balance. And so I got my undergraduate degree in environmental science, and was studying mostly like terrestrial land use change stuff. So I think in my intro they mentioned the whole aquaculture project in the Amazon. So I was in the Peruvian Amazon for a while, looking at deforestation rates and how they change with fish farming. And that kind of led me to graduate school. I went to get a master's degree at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. It was a master's of environmental management. While I was studying climate change, coral reefs were on the top of mind. I became a scuba diver maybe 5 or 6 years before that, and saw how reefs were dying, and kind of was on this research path where I could continue doing academic research, but decided that I thought I could make a lot bigger impact and potentially have a lot more fun by leaving graduate school, not going on for a PhD, but finishing my master's and then starting a company that was aimed at trying to solve one of these issues I cared about. And it was at Yale that I linked up with my co-founder, Sam. And Sam had previously done one of those in-ocean traditional coral farms and was telling me about reef restoration. I had never heard of it before, knew how was happening with reefs, but didn't know that there was a way we could bring them back to life. And so we kind of teamed together and we're like, if we could do this, that could make a cool company. Let's try to see where it can go. And things really snowballed from there. We kind of figured out that it wasn't really very scalable when you think of the global problem, and we started linking up with different researchers who are doing different things and ended up getting investment. And here we are 3 years later in the Bahamas with a coral farm just about up. So that's kind of the path that took me here. But I always knew I wanted to work in the environment field and was working in the environment field in a number of different capacities before starting Coral Vita.
Perfect. I also have a question. So you mentioned that through being able to do it in the tanks, you're able to make them a little more resilient, and especially with like temperature and other things. Are you guys focusing on just mostly the global warming aspect, or are you like building up kind of other immunities against like sunscreen or like other kind of things that are hurting the corals?
Mm-hmm. So right now we're focusing on warming ocean temperatures and acidifying oceans. So the more global warming, climate change threats, because that's really the large-scale threats to coral reefs. We also are trying to figure out ways to make our corals more resilient against different diseases, because that's been a huge problem with warming ocean temperatures. The different bacterias and viruses that are able to live basically shift where they're living. And so corals are subject to a whole host of new viruses and pathogens that have been causing significant damage in the Caribbean especially. And so thinking through how we make those corals more resilient to disease is another issue we're starting to do some R&D on, but there's definitely still a long way to go on that front. So we're mainly focused on the warming and acidifying oceans, although the other significant threats to coral reefs are local human impacts, so pollution or overfishing. And while we'd love to, be a company that could work on all these issues, we're kind of focused on the coral farming and the actual resilience of the corals themselves. And we partner with local nonprofits and organizations that are already doing great work from the marine protected areas side of things and the pollution side of things. And then we also are not saying we can restore every reef in the world. Basically, we were asked once by a hotel to restore the reef offshore of this hotel. We started doing some analysis on it, and the hotel was next to a river mouth. Upstream of the river was a textile factory, and the water quality was incredibly polluted. So there was no way we were going to restore that reef. We told them, hey, you deal with your pollution issues and we'll come back and restore your reef. But for now, we're trying to choose places that have already done progressive measures against things like pollution and overfishing to give our corals the best chance of surviving when we put them out there.
Awesome. Thank you.
If no one else has any questions, I'll wrap it up right there. Let's see. We would like to thank you again, Gator, for being with us here today. Our next meeting will be the week of April 15th, and more information will be sent out soon. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week, and we will see you in a few weeks.
Thanks
That
a lot.
concludes
Appreciate
Big
it.
West Rotaract's 9th meeting of its first year. Meeting adjourned.
Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Gator. Really appreciate it.